Catherine, what is adtech, and can you tell us a bit about the industry?
So adtech is often used as a kind of shortcut for talking about the way, the sort of the systems that underpin online advertising today. And I guess to explain it, you have to go back probably 50 odd years to think about how advertising used to work in the past. Because we used to have channels where you could reach a lot of people just through putting one advert on one TV break during one program. You could reach probably like 80% of the population in a particular country that way as an advertiser. Obviously now that's not the case anymore. The way that people consume media is much more fragmented, and with the advent of the internet, our attention is in 100 places all the time. We're not all sitting in front of one TV channel watching one advert at the same time. So I suppose adtech was kind of born out of a challenge where advertisers who were used to having those kind of massive audiences through buying one advert, advertising placement, adtech kind of enables an advertiser in some way, in theory, and we'll get into the reality of it a bit later, but in theory it enables an advertiser to reach audiences for their advertising across multiple different channels across the internet. So whether you're looking, at a recipe blog, you're on Facebook, you're on YouTube, an advertiser is able to reach you with an advert. I think that when we think about ad tech, I mean, digital advertising overall accounts now for about 47% of global ad spend, and it's growing by about 10% year on year. So that's worth about $300 billion globally. And when you look into it, we've done some surveys with our members where they tell us about 65% of the digital advertising they do is based on some form of targeting. So that could be targeting based on personal data, which I guess we're going to be talking quite a lot about today. And that's actually what often when regulators talk about ad tech, they're talking about that slice of the pie. But there's also about a third of that that's coming from contextual advertising right now, and that's set to grow by about 80% over the next 5 years. There's also programmatic, which is probably a word it's worth me mentioning now because I think it's probably going to come up in the discussion. So programmatic is a type of digital advertising where effectively it's a sort of automated system that actually Ravi probably knows a lot more about how to explain this than I do. But it's a sort of automated system where an advertiser can see in the system, or they can say, okay, this is an ad I have for Coca-Cola. I want it to be seen by people who might be interested in this product because of XYZ things that the system knows about them. And at the other end of the system, a publisher can say, this is all the advertising space I've got available. And through the collection of data, those two things can be matched through the programmatic system. Programmatic accounts for about 41% of digital advertising today, but it really varies across markets. So it's really big in America. So it's about 50% of digital advertising in the US. It's about 30%, I think, in Europe, and then it's even less in APAC. So it's about 20% in APAC. So it's quite a lot of variation that we see as advertisers across the market in terms of how programmatic works and like who's actually using those systems.
I mean, it sounds quite efficient. So Ravi, I wonder whether you could tell us why this might be controversial.
Of course, yes. It's a very interesting system. As Catherine very well described, there are a number of features to ad tech. It's not just one system, there are a variety of systems. And the system that's most controversial, maybe under most scrutiny, is a system, programmatic advertising, real-time bidding, where you have an advertiser trying to get a audience member to see their advert, and that exchange between the advertiser and the person seeing a website, the visitor to a website, is very complicated and very technical. But what sits between those two ends is a real-time auction for your attention, and that auction allows hundreds, thousands of different companies to hover up information about you. And we are instructed by individuals in the UK and in Ireland to file complaints about the lack of security over personal data during that transaction, because once that transaction opens up, data flows across the chain to a number of companies that you have no idea are receiving that information. So we act for these individuals that have filed complaints in the UK and in Ireland, and those complaints have now been spun out into 17 different countries across Europe because of the concerns over the lack of security over that data, because you just don't know who's getting that information. There's no integrity or confidentiality over that information. And the way the protocols around those systems operate mean that you don't have any real transparency or understanding or involvement with the way those systems work. And as of today, the two lead supervisory authorities for the main companies that run these protocols, the IAB Europe and Google, under investigation by those lead supervisory authorities for potential breaches of the data protection regulations. And the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK in June last year put out a report about the industry, particularly real-time bidding, with real substantial concerns about the way the industry is operating. And it's telling that the regulators that have looked at this from a data protection perspective have found that the industry cannot comply with these fundamental human rights contained in the data protection regulations.
Cannot comply.
That's what the regulators are finding. So the regulators in Belgium have said that the IAB Europe's framework for transparency and consent over the RTB protocol is not sufficient to comply with the GDPR. The Information Commissioner's Office have said the way the system operates, again, cannot comply in its current form with the GDPR, and demanded change from the industry, gave the industry 6 months. Now, the ICO hasn't followed up maybe as effectively as we might want, but the ICO made clear what the position was about how they viewed consistency with the GDPR and the protocols that were in play. So the industry should change to protect our rights. It's that straightforward. And if the cost of having your rights protected is maybe less effective advertising, that might be a cost worth paying. And actually, one has to question the effectiveness of behavioral advertising anyway.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So, Catherine, Ravi's mentioned some of the potential impacts or risks and issues for consumers. Are there any for advertisers from this model of advertising?
Well, yeah, I think exactly what Ravi has just explained is obviously something that advertisers see as a huge concern. I think that advertisers would want to see a digital advertising market that is more responsible in the way that it protects and upholds the law effectively, as Ravi said, on the use of personal data. I think there are other issues as well. From a societal perspective as well, I think there are lots of concerns from advertisers right now around the way that advertising could be incentivizing the spread of illegal and harmful content on some platforms as well. There's a sense that advertising funds, I think 99% of Facebook's annual revenue comes from advertising, and I think about 89% of Google's revenue comes from advertising. So at WFA, the organization I work at, we represent the big global advertisers. So we represent about 120 big advertisers. It's P&G, Unilever, Mars, people like that. These are companies that are pouring a lot of money into the system, and they're also companies that care a lot about their corporate reputation, and therefore there's an increasing concern about the sense of what are we actually funding? Are we funding a system that is abusing human rights from a data perspective? Are we funding a system that is spreading harmful and illegal content and impacting democracy? So those are two really big societal issues. But I also think it's worth mentioning from an advertiser perspective. Obviously, there's ultimately business issues that are really important, and those tend to be the ones that get the attention of the boards and the shareholders as well. This is a market which is notoriously opaque, as Ravi mentioned. one of our members, the UK Advertiser Association, did a study recently where they tried to audit the way that money flowed through the adtech supply chain, which is incredibly complex. And that showed that there was 15% of every dollar that's spent in the advertising supply chain that just isn't accounted for. So the $1 goes in. Actually, about 51% gets to the publisher at the end, the person actually selling the advertising space. And in between, you have these intermediaries, the ad tech system that takes a cut. And in most places, you can see sort of more or less the category of a company that's taking a cut. But there's 15% where they just couldn't track. They have no idea where it goes. That is a huge market issue. You know, I mentioned this is a $300 billion market. Annually, globally, 15% of that is an awful lot of money. So this is a notoriously opaque market. I think that's a huge issue for advertisers, and it makes it very, very hard then to understand how effective the advertising is, because it's essentially a black box right now. And that is something that advertisers have been calling for a long time, and we are still working on that. It's also a market which is dominated by a small handful of players. So from a WFA perspective, our members tell us that about 70% on average of their digital advertising spend goes to two players, Google and Facebook. And a market structure like that makes it very, very hard to hold those dominant platforms to account for all of the things that we've just been talking about. And I think that's why we are seeing a lot of interest in the digital advertising market from regulators who are looking into competition issues at the moment all around the world, in the UK, Australia, the US now, also in Brussels. And this is something which I think is definitely a very, very important point, because of the way that advertising funds the internet, as in the way I was just explaining.
So what kind of ad tech industry would you like to see, and is there anywhere that you think is getting it right, or is along the right path?
I think that an ad tech market which takes those responsibilities seriously, so one that is more responsible in the use of personal data and in reducing and disincentivizing the spread of harmful illegal content. And I think that advertisers would like to see a market which is more open and more transparent, because actually doing that could go some way to helping solve some of the other issues that I just mentioned.
Yeah, I want us to return to transparency and accountability in a bit. But Ravi, what kind of ad tech market or industry would you like to see? And is there anywhere that's getting it right, do you think?
So there's really interesting real-time examples of publishers and advertisers using alternative means. So for example, the New York Times turned off pragmatic and real-time bidding advertising, and the Dutch public broadcaster turned off pragmatic advertising, and the Dutch public broadcaster released the revenue they were getting without using pragmatic and behavioral advertising, and their revenue increased. So I think there are credible alternatives that don't require surveillance of consumers at their core.
Okay, so here's a proposal to you both, and I'll start with Ravi. So one way of introducing competition might be to require ad tech companies to share the data that they have, so other companies can participate, which means more sharing of personal data. So could that be one solution, Ravi? So
I think trying to cure a data free-for-all by increasing the free-for-all is never going to be a healthy way to solve a problem. It's inherently unlawful, as I've said, in the way it currently operates, so adding to that illegality is not really a solution. I think what we need to see is meaningful transparency. It's not enough to have just consent pop-ups that say, click these buttons and see what's going on. There has to be meaningful transparency. And that meaningful transparency has to occur across the ecosystem. And if that means that, for example, to Catherine's point again about the 15% example, if you cannot account for that 15% either way across that chain, then that insecurity it can't be fixed. And unless and until that problem can be plugged and solved, then I don't think we should be talking about increased data sharing. We should be talking about increased transparency, both for consumers and for publishers at the other end, and advertisers.
Catherine, increasing competition by increasing data sharing?
Yeah, I agree with Ravi. I think the solution here isn't about sharing personal data more. But 3 in 4 advertisers tell us that they don't think they get enough data from platforms. And here we're not talking about consumer data here, personal data. We're talking that the 2 main places where they say they don't get enough data is firstly around effectiveness of the advertising, and secondly about the remuneration within the supply chain. So it's entirely possible that actually there is some data that could be shared more within this ecosystem between advertisers, publishers, and ad tech, which would help move towards a more open and transparent market without necessarily needing to get to the level of granular detail that would impact privacy. So we're talking about data like, for example, measurement data, right? Reach, frequency, engagement at an aggregated level. How many people have seen the ad? How many times was an ad shown to people, and did anyone click on the ad or engage with it in any way? Also things like brand safety data, right? So brand safety is around brands trying to control better where their ads appear online, what content the ads appear next to, and a lot of it is around avoiding ads appearing next to content which is illegal or harmful or just doesn't really fit with the brand's equity. And for that, again, right now advertisers are really struggling to get basic information around like what is the prevalence of that type of content on a particular platform, how many ads are actually appearing next to that type of content, and also transaction data as well. So this is sort of moving a bit more into the retail area, but a lot of advertisers say we would love to have more insight around like how people are browsing for our products on e-commerce sites, for example. Again, we don't need to know that Catherine was looking for that pair of shoes, but we would like to know, when people look at our brand pair of shoes, what do they do afterwards? Like what 50% of them go and buy a competitor shoe? That would be interesting for us to know. If 50% of them actually don't go and buy any shoes, that's also useful to know. So that's the kind of data that I think could help foster a more open and transparent market, which could then go some way to helping advertisers hold platforms more accountable and make more informed decisions about where their money is going. The supply chain piece is obviously massive. We've covered that in quite a lot of depth. But what I would say is also on all of this, what's really crucial and what's really missing today is also that all of this data being provided, being provided first of all, but then also being provided in a way which is standardized and harmonized across different platforms so that advertisers can actually compare apples with apples and make decisions based on that. Because today, even when you do get some of this data, it tends to be like quite piecemeal and it's very specific to each platform. So it's impossible to compare, to say, okay, how did my ad campaign actually work? And where did it work the best? Was it on Facebook? Was it on YouTube? Was it actually when I bought stuff directly from a publisher? That just is missing right now. And there's a lot of work going on in the industry. Actually, WFA is leading a kind of a piece of work around cross-media measurement to try and get to this. But when you think about it, it's crazy that we're not already in this place. So there is data sharing that I think could be helpful here. But it doesn't necessarily have to be personal data.
That's really interesting, and I think the idea of showing other kinds of data other than personal data to improve competition, that that also ties in with what Ravi was saying earlier, that maybe there should be more transparency and accountability about how effective this advertising actually is. Some of it might actually be snake oil, and that's really important. Thank you. And I also like your point about the kind of interoperability. At least just being able to compare data infrastructures would allow you to do your own analyses about whether something was effective. So both of you have mentioned the importance of transparency. So I think some of the controversy around ad tech is, maybe there isn't transparency on which adverts are being shown to which people or to which communities. And so you can get sort of quite a polarizing effect, and so I wondered whether you think there's any ways of introducing any accountability into the industry about which adverts are being shown to which people. So political advertising is the kind of perhaps most high profile version of this, and knowing what messages have been given to what sort of social or economic groups. But it must affect the kind of commercial products too. So I'll start with Ravi.
Okay, So it's a really interesting point. What does transparency mean in practice? Is it transparency of the way personal data is being used, or to Catherine's points about the way adverts are actually effective or not, where the money's going? There's all sorts of levels of transparency. Taking the political example as one context, and I've done work with Oxford Internet Institute on political advertising. So this idea of adverts from political parties need maybe in imprints, digital imprints like you have in physical advertising from political parties, is obviously one that most people support and would lead to greater transparency around political advertising. One of the problems with that proposal is, firstly, it would only apply to political parties, and it's very easy. In fact, most political advertising nowadays on Facebook and other social media platforms is grassroots advertising. Do you have to then do a digital imprint there? Where does it stop? Where's the line? And that's symptomatic of a wider problem within ad tech, is understanding what is an advert and understanding where those adverts are going. I'm not entirely sure if advertisers know where their adverts are ending up. And one of the other problems with how that system operates is there's a lot of fraud happening with websites that are perpetuating real-time bidding by siphoning off customers on bad websites and increasing the growth of those bad websites, while at the same time advertisers are not really sure where those adverts are going. Another problem with that type of advertising is you segment society into demographics, and you might lead to discrimination in job adverts, housing, etc., that are being received. We see that quite acutely in the US, where there have been cases against Facebook for discriminatory advertising for housing and jobs, which is really problematic. That the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, had to bring a case to say this is happening on your platform, and Facebook had to resolve it at that end, rather than proactively saying, well, here are some problems. And there's this idea that seems very simple as a solution to this type of thing, which is having data protection by design, privacy by design and by default, understanding before you release a product the impact that product's going to have. And it seems that a lot of these issues require civil society organizations to bring these problems to the attention of these huge companies, where there's an asymmetry of power, asymmetry of resources, yet these civil society organizations are having to shine a light on the problems the industry is creating. So micro-targeting is a real problem, but not just for the micro-targeting, but for a wider societal number of reasons as well.
So that's really interesting. And you mentioned different categories of maybe kind of products or services that maybe shouldn't be kind of advertised in this almost personalized way. Catherine, in the last few minutes that we have left, I'd love to get a perspective from an advertiser. So micro-targeting could be it's almost the extreme end of that efficiency in the market, right? Getting the right adverts for the right products in front of the right people. Do you have any sense from an advertiser's perspective that this might not be welcome, or that, or maybe if there was an ethical way of doing it, would it be welcome, or could transparency alone address some of the risks around that approach? It's a lot to ask you, but let's go for it.
Yeah, I mean, the word micro-targeting is interesting because it's used a lot in policy context, but a little bit less in actually the advertising industry. Because actually, when you think, as I said before, when you think about digital, like 65% of digital spend is based on some form of targeting. And from an advertiser perspective, targeting could be behavioral targeting based on what you know about people's behaviors, and that's about 2/3 of that, but 1/3 of that is contextual. For an advertiser, that's still some form of targeting. So I think on micro-targeting, I mean, of course, it shouldn't be used to discriminate. And what's really important, as Ravi just pointed out on that requires, again, more transparency across the supply chain. Because even if an advertiser at the top says, yeah, we have some great ethical principles around like ways in which we will and won't use micro-targeting, and ways we will and won't discriminate, hopefully we won't discriminate against people, that needs to feed down at all levels of the supply chain, to the platform, to the ad server, to the publisher, to make sure that there's at no point anyone in the chain that's taking kind of the directions from the advertiser and misinterpreting or putting them into a category, which can happen quite a lot. At a certain point, the advertiser tends to lose visibility of exactly what targeting is going on. and what type of data is being used. There's a lot of miscommunication that can happen. So that's a really, really important fundamental piece that needs to be in place. You need to have more transparency and openness in the supply chain to be able to tackle this. I think there's an important question around, again, the risk. What is it really worth the risk? Depending on what kind of products you're trying to advertise and what type of targeting you think might be useful, you really need to be doing that assessment. Is it really worth the risk? Because if there's a risk of discrimination, that can be exacerbated with the way that advertising works today. We did a really interesting survey of employees at Advertisers, and we came out with that 1 in 4 employees working in advertiser companies have felt uncomfortable at some point in their career about the way that their company uses data. And 1 in 10 said that they didn't feel that they could speak up about it, or they wouldn't know who to go to. And I think that's really, really telling. It means that much more needs to be done to make, at a corporate level, to make employees feel that the right safeguards and rails are in place so that this doesn't happen. I think that also, from a consumer perspective as well, there's often quite a lot of cases where people feel like they're being targeted, micro-targeted, based on some very, very intimate data about them. And actually it's just coincidence, or the advertiser's not even intending to do that. And I think this goes back to the point around how accurate is all of this targeting? Because if you read if you go to a marketing industry event, there are a lot of ad tech stands and people telling you all these amazing things. We can do this, we can do this, we can target down to this level, we can get to this level of detail about someone. We know everything about everyone, and therefore we know exactly when to show someone an advert for your product at the moment where they'll click it and buy it, and it's amazing. But actually, in reality, often a lot of the data in the system is not as accurate as you would think. There's been numerous studies that have gone some way to trying to prove this. And also, as we said, because of it's so opaque, there's very little accountability actually for an advertiser to say, well, I was trying to reach women in their 30s with this campaign. Did that actually happen? Or did a load of men in their 50s actually see this ad? And so without that kind of visibility and transparency, it's very difficult to have a conversation about micro-targeting. What was really interesting, there was a Kantar study released this year that just asked people.
I think we're going to have to stop you there, because I think we might have run out of time. But I loved your point that, it doesn't mean that the adverts are getting to the right people. And maybe offline I can tell you about some of the adverts I've been haunted by over the years. But I really liked what you were saying about the kind of, thinking about the employees at these companies. They may not be wanting to do, this might not be the outcome that they want either. And maybe that's something that, the sector as a whole can work with in the meantime until there's regulation in place to manage this. So thank you both very much. Really fascinating talk, and more that we could explore. And I hope we can.